The marathon is just about seeing long term, seeing a vision, understanding that nothing really worthwhile happens overnight, and just sticking to your script long enough to make something real happen. Laying a brick every day instead of trying to build a brick wall. Just lay a brick every day. Eventually you look up, you're gonna have a brick wall.
Welcome to OBAD-One Brick A Day. This is the book club where each month we pick a different book that talks about the Black American experience. This month's book is by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It is called Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? I'm gonna give a little background on this book because I think a little context is important, and then we're gonna get into the chapters. So, Where Do We Go From Here by Martin Luther King, once again, was written in 1967. King went to Jamaica and kind of got away from everything and wrote, which is probably his last manuscript before he was assassinated in 68. He dies in April 68, I believe April 4th, 68. And he writes this in 67. And the thing about 67 is, in this book, is that this is the culmination of all of King's philosophies coming together, right? And it's all of the watershed moments he experienced, and the March on Washington, the bus boycotts, the Voting Rights Act in 64, and the Civil Rights Act 65, which I think I have reversed. So it's all of these moments, but it's also 65 coming to 66 coming, the Black Power movement, his disillusionment a little bit with the white power structure, his fights with white liberals who supported the movement early and have slowly backed away, the uprisings happening all across the country. So King writes this book, and it's really him looking back at how we got here, and then also looking toward the future of the possibility of what the future could look like. So that's what we get from this book. So let's delve in a little bit with chapter 1, which is titled Where Are We? So once again, where are we? We're kind of looking toward the past. And so King realizes that 65 is the watershed moment, and everything preceding that was building to that. So he's been in this movement at this point maybe 10 years, and the bus boycott happens, and at that point, and this is relevant today, King's movement was asking for social change, right? They wanted access to certain things, right? So they wanted to be able to, clear example, to eat at a lunch counter and not be separated by color, to patronize in certain places and not be separated by color, right? To get on the bus and not be separated by color. Social changes, right? And they were able to accomplish that pretty quickly, all things considered, right? And so that builds into the movement that we have in the March on Washington in 63, and King is pushing Kennedy. When Kennedy's assassinated, he's pushing LBJ to pass the Voting Rights Act, which passes in 60. The Voting Rights Act passes in 64, and then we have the Civil Rights Act that passes in 65. So it's this beautiful moment, right? And King is writing about that, talking about that. But where he starts is actually in 1965. And 1965 is when the Watts uprising happens. And to give a little context of what happens is, there's a great migration that's happened. Blacks from the South are moving, dispersing, going north to places like Newark, New York, going to places like in the Midwest, Cleveland, right? In Chicago. But they're also going west. They're going to California. They're going to LA, right? But what else is happening is that, especially with LA, is that the police office is actually recruiting white Southerners to be part of the police force, right? And they are being hired to enforce part of their police force. And those cops are now enforcing the laws of Jim Crow to the new migrants, black migrants coming from the South, right? And so in 65, we have the uprisings. Usually you hear it as the Watts riots. In this context, we're going to call it uprising, because I think understanding what is actually happening and why this happens is important. And so black folks are tired. Black folks have been getting their ass whooped for years and years and years. And nonviolence was one of the king's tactic. And there's a lot that goes into that. We'll talk about the nonviolence as a tactic later. But black folks headed west, coming from the south, were tired of getting their ass whooped. They were tired of getting beat by the batons. They were tired of being restricted. When they thought that moving north or going west, that they were finally going to be able to purchase freedom, right? And in reality, they found that the racism in the west and in the north was a little bit more sophisticated, but was also more subtle and restrictive in a different way. Whereas in the south, it was just pure terror. It was out in the open, right? It's the wild, wild west, right? In the south, right? Lynchings are still happening at this time period in Mississippi and things like that. And if you listen to a lot of people from the south of that time, a lot of them understood and accepted how the south worked, right? And it was a clear understanding. You didn't go here, you did this. Whereas in the north, it's subtle. In the west, it's subtle. And so you have to approach it differently. The sophistication is different. And so what happens is the Watts Uprising. And you seen, if you haven't, you can Google it. There's footage of black folks finally pushing back, of defending themselves. And it burns, basically. Watts burns. Certain parts of LA burn. And King goes out there. And King is confronted with a new fragment of the movement, right? This is the seeds of the Black Power movement, which we talk about in chapter 2, right? And so King is watching black folks riot. And he is caught off guard, I think, a little bit by it, right? And I think he realizes he was fighting for social change when in fact he needed to incorporate and expand the fight. The fight needed to be the fight needed to be political, social, and economical. Right? Those were the three tenets. When in fact he was just fighting pretty much just the social. And so in chapter 1, King is really writing directly to white America. And he's really writing directly to the white folks that supported him, right? And now he sees that the white people that supported the movement did not understand that the movement was not going to be one move, right? It wasn't just going to be social change, right? That was the first wave. The second wave of equality was coming. And that's where you get the political and economical part. And then that's when you get a lot of white people going to the sidelines and asking for order, right? And King is angry. He's angry at white folks right now in a lot of ways. He's tired in a lot of ways. Because he's just asking for the basics. He's asking for what white folks get. He's asking for America to live up to its ideals that it espouses, but does not actually follow through on. So that's what chapter 1 is about, right? And I'm gonna read you a quote from chapter 1 that I think is: a final victory is an accumulation of many short-term encounters. To lightly dismiss a success because it does not usher in a complete order of justice is to fail to comprehend the process of achieving full victory. So in that, King is on one end talking to white folks, right? And on the other, he's talking to the Black Power movement too, right? And he's talking about how these small things add up. One brick a day, right? And you cannot dismiss it because you didn't get it the first time. Like, this is a long fight. And we have to understand the long view of this, right? And so he is talking to whites and his frustration and fatigue of that. And it's surrounded by what's happening in Watts. It's what's happening in Chicago, which King ends up living in Chicago for a while and really sees the vitriol and anger and hatred that white folks have when black people want better, want more than just the scraps, right? Whereas in the South, it was a few hundred people. When he goes to Chicago, it's thousands of people. Thousands of white people holding up Nazi signs. Mind you, this is in the 60s. holding up the Nazi sign, right? And so that's what chapter 1 is about. So let's move on to chapter 2 is titled Black Power. And in this is really where you get to see Martin's wrestling with the philosophies and wrestling with his own blackness in a lot of ways. Not necessarily his own blackness, but wrestling with the idea of where his place is and how nonviolence conflicts with black power to him, right? And so, remember, 66, James Meredith happened. So if you don't know the story of James Meredith was a man who pretty much was marching throughout Mississippi, black man, walking through Mississippi, registering black folks to vote from this Voting Rights Act. He walks in Mississippi by himself, doesn't contact anyone else, doesn't get NAACP next to him, anything. He just goes out and starts registering black folks to vote in Mississippi. And it becomes a thing. And Martin goes from like Chicago, Watts, he comes to Mississippi to help out, basically, to bring his platform at the time to this, right? And also in the same movement is Stokely Carmichael. And Stokely Carmichael becomes a figure. I'm not going to if you've never heard the name Stokely Carmichael, it's okay. We're going to read a book about Stokely in the next couple books. But for now, just understand. And James Meredith gets shot. And I think in the context of this story, that's kind of like the final straw. And Stokely Carmichael is at a rally. Martin's there too as well. And he evokes the words black power. What we demand, what we want is black power. And black power at the time is, I guess you consider it was the equivalent of Black Lives Matter of today. The philosophies are a little different. Obviously they're cousins, but there's similarities in the sense of it made people pause, right? And Martin actually is not on board with black power at first. He's apprehensive about it. To him, black power at first is the opposite of white power. And then he realizes that's not what Stokely's going after. But then he's also saying this black power is just anger, right? And anger absent of love is rage, and rage absent of love just goes everywhere, and it consumes everything, and most importantly, consumes you. And it's okay to be angry, right? It is okay to be disappointed, but it is not okay to let that fester, right? And to Martin, black power is the festering of black rage. In that, the thing about Martin is that he does not look at racism. He looks at racism as cancer, right? He looks at racism as a sickness, and that black folks in a lot of ways are the doctors in this metaphor, and the tools that you're should use is nonviolence, right? And Stokely Carmichael was like, nah, I'm not with it. Like, I grew up in New York. I went through that. I'm watching James Meredith get shot. America's based on, founded on violence, and the audacity of you to tell all your people to have guns and all your people to defend themselves. But when it comes to black folks, we have to be nonviolent. And so Stokely Carmichael is completely, fragmented from the movement in a lot of ways. He's within the movement, but he's fragmented, right? And the great thing about Martin is that one of the things I admire about Martin Luther King is that even if he disagreed with you, he asked questions and he listened, and he really did take in your point of view and really see where you were coming from, and then be able to incorporate it into his philosophy, right? Without being dismissive. Like how I told you in the beginning, he heard it as white power or whatnot, but like there's meetings he has with Stokely. He invites Stokely Carmichael to his house, right? And other members that are around SNCC, and has dinner and breaks bread with them and really listens. And he comes to find out and understand what black power is. And he also sees the potential and the power. And if done correctly, black power is no different than freedom now, right? And Freedom Now was a slogan he was trying to get, the Black Power movement to accept, and they really weren't for it. They wanted to be very specific. They purposely picked Black Power, and they purposely announced it on King's platform because they knew King's reach, right? And so King takes in Black Power, and he understands, and the thing that's happening in the book, and that segues into chapter 3, which is racism and white backlash, is remember those 3 tenets. Is that Martin is no longer just asking for social justice. He's asking for political justice. And most importantly, as far as this country is concerned, he's demanding economic justice, right? It's one thing to be able to get on the bus and not have to be harassed and not to be treated as less than. That's one thing. It's a whole nother thing to say, you owe me for all of the free labor, all of the free services. I have a right to decent housing. I have a right to education. I have a right to health care. I have a right to be part of the political movement, right? Those things are different asks because all of those things have a cost. You have to actually go in your pocket and give something up. You have to give up power or have power taken from you, right? And in those last 2 asks, that is the shifting and the evolution of Martin Luther King, right? Right now, we are taught as Martin Luther King is a flat character. And we talk about Martin as the nonviolent civil rights leader, when he was actually obviously a lot more than that. And just within the context of this book, he's actually completely radical. And mind you, in 67, he's hated, right? In 67, we have the Vietnam War happening. And for a while, Martin was quiet on the war. He didn't make an official statement. And he's being pushed to make a statement to be anti-Vietnam. And at this time, this is controversial, right? Like, this is not something you do, right? Only like the communists. Like, this is the time when, like, if you come out against the war, you were labeled as a communist in this country, which is not a good thing. You were pretty much blacklisted. And King, for a while, avoids that. Like, he avoids foreign policy. He avoids the war in a lot of ways. And there are people saying, no, Martin, you really need to make a statement about this. So at the same time, Martin is doing the political. At the same time, he's doing the economical. At the same time, he's doing the social. He is also now being asked to do the militarization of this country. And he makes a statement, a very powerful statement. It's considered one of his best speeches. And the point he makes in the book is that one of America's biggest contradictions is that they praise black folk for being nonviolent with white folk in America. But at the same time, they're shipping black folk off to fight in Vietnam. And understand, in America, we call it the Vietnam War. It is not called the Vietnam War in Vietnam. It's called the American War. And the contradiction is that, once again, I'm going to repeat that, is that white folks praise black folk for being nonviolent in America towards white folk. But at the same time, ship off black folk en masse to go fight a war in Vietnam, to slaughter Vietnamese people. And so Martin, that's the space that Martin makes the statement, is that he is nonviolent. Nonviolent is not just a local thing. Nonviolent is not just Montgomery, Alabama. Nonviolent is not just Chicago, Illinois. Nonviolent is not just Watts, California. Nonviolent is not just Harlem, New York. Nonviolent is global now, right? Martin is now expanding his pushback on the American establishment, right? He's pushing back in all of the facets. And if you really want to like put a target on yourself in this country, the other thing that Martin does that really, I think, unfortunately puts a target on Martin's back is that not only the economical, political, and social thing happening, there's the other thing he does. He's also putting together with the woman's name. Also wants to start the Poor People's Campaign, which comes from Marion Elderman. She presents this to him, and he takes on the Poor People's Campaign. And it's supposed to be in 1968. He is planning another march. And this is what I think puts a target on Martin's back. Two things. He goes against the war, which is woo, right? And then second, he is now trying to create a movement that is inclusive of pretty much all poor people, right? Regardless of race. So, and have a movement on the Washington steps, right? If you want to put a target on your back in this country and really scare people and really have the power structure show its full muscle, either ask for what you are owed, demand what you are owed, call out what you are owed, but also bring together a coalition of not only poor minorities, but include poor whites in that. If you are able to take the cataracts off their eyes and get poor whites to see your vision and have them buy in, then the entire white supremacy structure dismantles in one swipe. It's gone, right? Because what the brunt force of white supremacy comes from is not just like the presidents and the government, right? That abstract thing, like the government's out. No. It is the brunt force comes from poor whites. They do all the dirty work, right? The brunt force comes from the police force, right? That's the spear that goes that breaks the skin, right? That does the dirty work, that gets his hands dirty, that does the killing, right? That has the blood on their hands. Physically, you see it. If you are able to get them to wash their hands and see and have them acknowledge, right, the wrong that they've done and also join in, you're a target. You're an op, right? And when Martin makes that statement against the Vietnam War, what happens is also in the newspaper, it was considered treason, right? And it became such a thing in '67. He is hated by a lot of people, like people that stood by him that were black preachers distanced himself from Martin, right? And that's how we get this book. Martin is for the first 3 chapters looking at the past and trying to get folk to not come together and join hands, but to acknowledge their sins, to repent those, to acknowledge those, and really go through the transformation of redemption. He believes that people can change, that racism is a cancer, and the cure is nonviolence. The cure is looking your enemy in the eye and saying that you hate their actions, you do not hate them. It is showing your enemy your dignity, and by doing that, by disarming them with nonviolence, that they will then see your humanity. That is what Martin believes. And he is trying to show a vision of the possibilities of America that is a community, right? We are all one community. And he is trying to get the black in and see that racism can be extracted and that America could really be this great thing. And so that's where Martin is right now. And so I'm gonna stop there, and we're gonna go forward and talk about the next 2 chapters, and then talk about the impact of this book and give some more historical context. So thank you for listening. I really appreciate you. This is OBAD-One Brick A Day, and stay tuned. We're going to finish the next 3 chapters. We're going to go through 4, 5, and 6. We're going to go through the dilemma of the Negro Americans, where are we going, and we're going to go through the World House, which is really about the future and then the larger nation itself. So Stay tuned. Once again, thank you for listening. Thank you if you made it this far. I really appreciate it. This is OBAD-One Brick A Day. Be back next Sunday. I'm gonna try to upload this a little earlier. Eventually, we're gonna get a consistent time. I promise. I'm staying with this. I'm committed to this, and I hope you're committed to this as well. Thank you. I'm Mel Rose. This is OBAD. Peace.